Hello, and a warm welcome to all our viewers and listeners joining us from different parts of the world. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Global South Indaba, a platform that brings together voices and ideas shaping a more inclusive, just, and sustainable world. In our first episode, we explored decoloniality through the lens of history and the humanities. Today, we continue the conversation from a new and exciting angle: science, sustainability, and storytelling. Our guest today is a remarkable scholar and advocate whose work embodies the spirit of decolonial thought through scientific practice, environmental stewardship, and public engagement. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tatenda Murangi, a translational immunologist and sustainability advocate from the teapot-shaped country of Zimbabwe. Dr. Murangi's work bridges science, policy, and storytelling, challenging traditional boundaries of knowledge and reimagining how science can serve the global south. Dr. Murangi, welcome to the Global South Indaba. We are delighted to have you with us today. To begin, could you briefly introduce yourself? Who's Dr. Tatenda Murangi and what has shaped your journey across science, sustainability, and storytelling?
Thank you very much, Mr. Shkwaza, for such an amazing introduction. I think, like most people that are recent graduates, it's kind of like still fascinating for someone to call me doctor. So I always get a big flashback when you say that. But I think just to answer what you said, just give a brief introduction of myself before we get into the crux of the matter. I think I am a translational immunologist. Trained in the biomedical field as a scientist with a PhD in clinical science and immunology. So my work has pretty much been more in the clinical space as well as the preclinical space, trying to work with both human models as well as animal models. And this pretty much started off in undergraduate at the University of Technology, where I was doing bachelor in biology, measuring tropical disease biology, and then from there I moved over to the University of Cape Town. That was my first time leaving Zimbabwe as well, so that was an interesting experience. While I was there, I began my new journey as a master's student, and then after that I further went on to do my postdoctoral fellowship at Trinity College Dublin. So it has been quite an interesting journey because I've had the opportunity to work in 4 different countries throughout my career, because I forgot to mention that I was also in Germany at some point. So that was very interesting. I got to see science from different perspectives, be it from a Zimbabwean perspective, from an African perspective, being in South Africa, looking at how people in Zimbabwe, people in South Africa looked at science from a different perspective, how the institutions run as well, but also the African perspective versus the Eurocentric perspective when I now went to Germany as well as in Ireland, realizing that we kind of like look at science from different ways. And I think that was a very interesting thing to note, which I'm sure we're going to add up on during our conversation.
Interesting. So you have been to all these geolocations. You've been to Germany, you have been in Ireland, and of course, coming from Zimbabwe and then South Africa. What a journey it has been. Maybe just to frame the conversation, our theme today, Reflections on Decoloniality, a Multidisciplinary Dialogue, invites us to think about how knowledge itself can be decolonized, not only in the humanities, but also in science and policy. Dr. Murangi, when we think of decoloniality, it is often discussed in cultural or historical terms. From your perspective as a scientist, what does decoloniality mean and why is it an urgent conversation for the global south today?
So I think let me start by saying that it's a very interesting thing to ask a scientist what decoloniality is. But I think we are so used to being in spaces where such conversations are meant for historians, right? And I think as I've been going through my journey, I've realized that in as much as we want to be limited to particular disciplines, that also limits our understanding of the world. And we need to understand that as a PhD, I think you are a doctor of philosophy, you are a doctor in learning, which means your learning should not be confined to one viewpoint or one form of knowing, which I think most people would like to call being undisciplinary or multidisciplinary. But like with the basis of that, I think this has made me to kind of like it wasn't something that I have been thinking about, like when you call up with science and decoloniality, but from my perspective, I started to realize that these are necessary conversation. Reason being, okay, to set the tone, definitions matter, right? Definitions are critical when we're looking at different things. And from the scientific perspective, I started to realize that when you're looking at decolonization, which is kind of like the word that everybody knows, we are pretty much looking at how governments have changed and how power has transitioned over time, right? The first thing that comes, being a Zimbabwean myself, I start thinking about independence, right? But then when you look at decoloniality, it has been a new term for me as well. And I've been trying to fully understand and grasp the context of it. And I think it's very interesting because when you look at decolonization, it's the change of power. Is you now have the power, right? You are now being put in the spaces where the power is. But when you're looking at decoloniality now, you're looking at the systems and the framing of the setting that you're in. And when you're looking from the scientific point of view, I think it is very important to look at who is in charge of the knowledge that we are working on, right? Whose problems are defining the research agendas that we have, and also whose realities shape the identities of the science and the health that we're trying to look into. And I think when I started looking from that perspective, it became very vivid to me because when you're looking at decolonization, you're talking about, okay, since independence, a lot of African countries have gone on the drive of training a lot of African doctors, a lot of African scientists, right? But when you're not talking about decoloniality, we are talking about in as much as they have been trained, but under which framework are they being trained, right? Which ideas do they have? How do they articulate the science? Which worldview do they use when they're articulating the science? So in this regard, we're looking at how science itself is imagined, taught, and is practiced. And I think to give you a clear example of when we're talking about decoloniality in the scientific space, we are trying to look at an example would be trying to involve your traditional leaders in health policy, right? Because we all know that this is a fact. We all know that when you go to the rural areas, or even in some of the urban places, when people are sick, they will go to a traditional healer, right? The hospital itself, in as much as those are establishments that are there, people wouldn't go to them because they would start thinking about the cost of it, right? But they will go to a traditional healer because that is what they've grown up doing and they've seen a lot of people going there and it works for them, right? So instead of demonizing those institutions, how can we then practically put them as part of our health policy as countries? Because these are our lived realities, and instead of shunning them, we need to incorporate them and streamline them to benefit the society. So when we are talking about decoloniality, we are talking about the reframing of how we look at science, um, and how is it going to be beneficial to our people.
Interesting. And I like the example that you give there about maybe somebody that is in the rural areas and how they would maybe go to a traditional healer and how they could, through a scientific process, get the scientific answer that they are looking for, which gets us to, I think, to rethink thinking about how we think about science, because it's almost like science has often been defined in a certain way, but within the Western context, and rather excluding how it could be understood or potentially be
Yeah,
understood in other contexts, which I think for me, sort of enhances those matrices of power that I think people like Anibal Quijano do talk about. Interesting, Dr. Murangi. How would you distinguish then between decolonization, which you were talking about when you were talking about how Zimbabwe, for instance, in the context of Zimbabwe, how Zimbabwe got its independence, that is on 18 April in 1980, and decoloniality now, that the one that you just been talking about, particularly within the scientific research and health systems? How would you distinguish the two concepts, decolonization and decoloniality?
Okay. I think maybe just to increase in that, I think I'll just touch on an example that I gave in that when you're talking about decolonization, you're changing from who is in power, right? Who is in control of the different resources, right? Who is leading the research institutions, right? Changing faces or changing the people or the bodies involved. So you
Mm-hmm.
found that, like in Zimbabwe, you do have a situation where we are training a lot of African scientists. In South Africa, it's the same thing. In a lot of African countries, there's a lot of training of a lot of scientists. There's a lot of training of um, um, of Africans in different sectors. But I think where the challenge is the decoloniality aspect, in that in as much as we are training people, but under which framework, right? Because we are doing things that is now devoid of our current realities. An example like what I gave is that we need to understand the context that we are working in. What systems are we used to, and what systems we're currently using? We have people that have been using traditional healers, right? We had our own ways of communicating when it comes to, let's talk about mental health per se. People talk to our grandmother. A clear example would be the initiative by Professor Dixon Chibanda, where he's done the friendship bench, where grandmothers are have now taken the role of being counselors within communities. Those become your first point of contact because that is what the people are used to. So it is not it is not looking at our communities as if we need a restructuring or new things, but at looking at what is currently working in the community and adding onto that. Because with the friendship bench, what they have done is that they've realized, oh, in our communities, we are used to talking to our grandmothers when we have problems. So why not take these grandmothers and make them counselors, right? And train them and equip them in a way that they are capable of giving a mental health um, being like a very big mental health resource. They sit there, they see their patients, they talk to them, they do follow up. That is training someone that already knows what they're doing. So I think it's coming to understand that when you are looking at our health systems, we do not need new things. We need to take a look at what we currently have, how it has been working, and start enhancing that. But yeah.
Interesting, as you were distinguishing between the two concepts, that is decoloniality and decolonization in the context of science, I was just reminded of how Dr. Gacheni Ndlovu, who was one of the prominent voices or contributors to the discourse of decolonization, especially in the context of Africa. I'm sure you're already acquainted with these works. How he makes reference to there being what he calls the political empire, and how there is what he calls the economic empire, and how there is also what he calls the cognitive empire, and how he distinguishes between the political empire and the metaphysical empire, which is the cognitive empire. And then he talks about the decolonization that you were talking about, getting power and getting independence, talking about how it was about seeking first the kingdom, the political kingdom. So for many of the formerly colonized countries, or at that particular point, what the nationalists were seeking, they were seeking the political kingdom first. So in other words, through the process of decolonization, they managed to dismantle the political empire. But that in itself was not sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was not sufficient. I think that's what you're making reference to, even in the example that you were giving about how we were then supposed to take a step further and begin to rethink thinking and beginning to unlearn, undo decades and centuries of miseducation. So that's really some interesting thoughts that I'm just, squeezing. Dr. Murangi, just to take the conversation a bit further, what might be some of the key principles of decoloniality that scientists researchers and educators should embrace to make their work more just and contextually relevant?
Okay. Yeah, that is a very good question. And I think it starts by looking at decolonization, decoloniality from the lens of reclaiming the right to define our own research questions, right?
Mhm,
But
mhm,
not only that, I think for me, I'm really passionate about indigenous knowledge systems. And
mhm,
I think it comes to a point where we need to start validating indigenous local knowledge as legitimate partners in scientific reasoning. Because
mhm,
at the end of the day, I always think about it from this perspective. When you were growing up, you look at science as not something that we do. You look at something as something that is done to you, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
not even by you as well. But now
mhm,
we've gotten to a point where it is being done by us, but not for us, right? And I look at decoloniality as when science is being done by us and for us, right?
mhm,
So that brings me to key principles that I would probably call epistemic humility, contextual relevance,
mhm,
as well as looking at language justice.
mhm,
By epistemic humility, I think is starting to realize that when we look at with science, there are many ways of knowing, and the Western scientific knowledge is not the only one, right? This brings into context that in as much as there is a lot that can be learned from there, but I think there's also a lot that can be learned from others. For example, like in the case that I was talking about, traditional knowledge systems, during one of my courses in undergrad, I remember we had a moment where in our ethnobotany course we went and talked to some community leaders about the some community leaders and traditional healers within that particular area. They started telling us what type of herbs they were using, which tree does this, and what, that was an eye-opening situation because I think from someone I think everyone wants to go to university, right?
yep,
And when you get to university, there's a sense of pride that you have because that's what the system has taught you, right? You feel like you are more than the people outside of those particular institutions. But when I was doing ethnobotany and we were talking to these traditional healers, it was an eye-opening thing because in my mind it then clicked that I'm surrounded by all these things, but I have no idea what all these plants can do. But these people, they've never seen the door of a university, but they know what each and every one of these plants can do. They know how to prepare each and every one of these plants. They are more useful to this community than I can ever be, right? But that made me understand that knowledge can be in many forms. And for me, that was a very important thing. So that's just touching on epistemic humility. When you talk about contextual relevance, I think you're also looking at the role of communities when we come to defining your research questions, right? And why you need to get the knowledge that you're looking at. One of the biggest things that was always fascinating to me is that during my biology years, even when I was in Cape Town, or University of Cape Town, when we are always presenting, like you always, as a scientist, you always justify why you are doing your research, right? And when we are justifying our research, we're always basing it on numbers from the United States, right? We're always basing it on numbers from Europe. And for me, I was asking myself, but we do have statistic bodies. We do have Ministry of Health that are always publishing results all the time. But it was such common practice to always base things based on what was being done globally. I'm not saying there is anything bad with doing that, but what I'm saying is that in most instances, I felt as if it was missing the point of addressing local problems. Because what it did is that coming from Zimbabwe, you're constantly presenting how neglected tropical diseases are a menace. And then I'm thinking to myself, I've never really seen the amount of people that are being said to be afflicted by these diseases. So is it a matter of us not really digging deep and seeing what is going on? Because I think that then shifts where our priorities are going to be. So by decoloniality, we need to get to a point where we define our own research questions based on what is happening in local communities. But also another key principle we'll be looking at language justice. Language justice from a perspective of going back to the example that I gave you to start with, if I was going to kind of like look at myself from a superior perspective because I could speak fluent English and not communicate well with the people that I was engaging in that community, there was going to be a strong break in communication, right? Because growing up now, you realize that a lot of Africans do not like speaking their African languages. And you see that in other developing nations as well, where the priority becomes using the most dominant languages, right? So at 5 years old, people are very prideful that, oh, my kid can speak English, which is an amazing thing. But I think we are also letting our own languages die down. What that has the ability of doing is that it disconnects the well-educated people from the people that they actually want to serve. Because what then that does is that you cannot communicate to those people. People within Zimbabwe, people within the rural areas of Zimbabwe, they want to talk to you in Shona. They have a high wealth of knowledge that they have, right? Which means that for us to have language justice, we need to come to a point where we realize that, in as much as we are educating and teaching people in English as the medium of instruction, we also need to find ways of incorporating local languages in defining specific diseases, because that is going to allow someone to know what their patient is talking about from a local perspective. Because now you have a medical practitioner who cannot understand what the patient is saying because the patient doesn't know the English term for it, right? And that in itself is going to cause a breach in service delivery within our communities. So I think for us to realize decoloniality um, um, from an African perspective within the science space, we really need to understand that epistemic humility is important. We need to contextualize our research questions to the communities that we're dealing with, and we need to practice language justice by incorporating local languages while we are teaching people and the practitioners of tomorrow. Yeah.
I'm learning a lot of big words there: epistemic humility, contextual relevance, justice when it comes to language. I mean, a lot of very interesting themes that are emerging from the discourse there. You have touched on very critical aspects. I should give it to you, and it makes me think about a lot of things when it comes to science. The first thing that I'm actually asking myself is, what is science in the first place? How do we define science? Who defines science? According to whose experiences? According to whose worldview do we define science? What is good science? There's these terms you guys use: good science. What constitutes good science? And also, as you were talking, I was beginning to reflect and asking myself, so who benefits from the science at the end of the day? You were talking about who defines the research questions. That's very critical. That's very important. And also, I was just asking myself, so then what is the role of those who have been othered? You remember,
Yeah.
because remember, in colonialism, in colonization as a system, in imperialism or imperialization, there are those who have been othered. There are those who have been marginalized. There are those who have been pushed to the edge as far as knowledge production is concerned, as far as science is concerned, as far as good science is concerned. But then I'm concerned from what you were saying. I'm now concerned to say, okay, so what is the role of those who have been othered and as much as science is concerned? And I'm also, I mean, a lot of thoughts are coming to me serendipitously. But like you said, I mean, there's so much there to digest, so much there to reflect on. And thank you so much for that. So I'm just going to proceed to another very important segment of our conversation, which is now about science, context, and the power of knowledge. Your academic journey from Chinhoyi University of Technology to the University of Cape Town and now Trinity College Dublin. I do understand you just completed that, but that has been and is truly inspiring. Your research on allergic sensitization to meat and how parasite exposure shapes immune responses in African populations challenges dominant narratives in global immunology. Could you share more about how this research reflects a decolonial approach to science, one that centers African realities and lived experiences?
I think as you were talking, I think having to define science is a very important thing. Science is a very systematic approach of doing something in a very measurable way, right? You need to have you need to be able to, in a very measurable way, from a qualitative and a quantitative point of view, right? You need to be able to measure what you're doing, and also you need to be getting at least the same result over and over again, which is why we talk about reproducibility in science. That's why we look at science as being facts, because you're going to do it over and over again, and it is going to give you the intended result because it's a scientific fact. It is measurable, so you can prove it, right? So for me, that's how I define science. It's a systematic way of doing something to get a particular result, and that is highly reproducible, right? So, with that being said, I think to just talk about decoloniality from the perspective of my research, I think I'll touch on contextual relevance. So, like you mentioned, I was working on the role of parasites when it comes to sensitization to meat allergy called alpha-gal, right? So how that started off in itself kind of like shows the contextual relevance in that is kind of like an offshoot of a bigger project that they were doing in South Africa. So there was this big project that was being done to try to map out the type of allergies that people had within the Western Cape. And while they were doing that particular study, they realized that there were a lot of people that were reporting to have um, allergies to red meat, right? And these people were above the ages of 5 even, because the study was only looking at people from the ages of 5 going downwards. But noticing that this work by Professor Michael Levine, who was my PhD supervisor, so it was kind of like looking at that particular study where they were mapping the amount of people that were suffering from different allergies. But throughout that, they realized that a lot of people over the age of 5 years old also had a lot of were reporting allergies to red meat, and it became something that was very interesting to them because for a lot of allergies, in as much as some people have them even after the ages of 5 years, but they kind of like wean off over time. So after realizing that, oh, you have this big cohort of people, right, that are reporting these allergies, and some of them were eating meat when they were younger, but now they're not eating meat anymore. That became the contextual relevance of the study, realizing that, oh, you have this community that is within an area that has different parasite exposures, and in science or within the allergy field, you have what is called the hygiene hypothesis, and looking at basically the hygiene hypothesis is looking at if you are in an environment where you are exposed to a lot of antigens when you are growing up, you are likely to have immune tolerance, right? So a lot of people in rural areas have lesser allergies because they're growing in an environment where they are exposed to a lot of environmental factors when they're growing up. So their immune system kind of like is well trained to not react with these particular allergens. But now you have a rural community, right, with people that are above the ages of 5 that are also having or exhibiting this allergy towards red meat. So that became very interesting to them. And that became the contextual relevance of the study. And so when we're talking about contextual relevance, we're talking about go to communities, see what is happening in communities, and then try to solve those problems. And when we're doing that study, we realized that there were certain tick species that we took from the cattle that those people were keeping. So we took ticks from cattle, from goats, from sheep, from horses, trying to figure out if these ticks had the allergen, right? Because it is when the ticks would bite the people that it would put the allergen into them, and then they would start mounting an immune response. So the ticks have a common protein that is also found in red meat. So now when the people would now start having red meat, they'll start having an allergic reaction to the meat, thinking that it is a tick bite, right? That is kind of like an overly simplified way of talking about the research. But for me, what that did is that it took a problem that the community was facing, right? And the problem being these people are having allergic reactions to meat. You look at, oh, what might be the factors? You collect the ticks, you collect all the parasites that are around those people. What do you do next? You try to see if these parasites are the causative agent. And what did we see? We found that it was two specific ticks, the South African bond tick and the red-legged tick, that were causing these allergic reactions. And so this information becomes very valuable to the community, because now you can start creating, you can start incorporating this into health policy. You start telling people, okay, when you have your cattle, the reason why you need to get rid of ticks is because if these ticks bite you, you're going to have an allergic reaction to this, right? You start also advising doctors, okay, if someone comes in and tells you they're having meat and they're having an allergic reaction, you might want to ask them which type of ticks they might have been exposed to, right? So what science is doing in this particular case, it is solving a local problem and making sure that the people in that particular community are well served and their quality of life is improved. Yeah.
Interesting, Dr. Murangi. Just some critical questions for you there. In terms of foregrounding that particular research, was it because the local communities were concerned? Was it that you, the scientists, are the ones that were concerned? Who was concerned? I mean, you were talking about earlier, you were talking about the research questions. For whom were these research questions important? That's the first question that I want to ask.
Mm.
The second question that I want to ask is, having done such a great, a rigorous, good science research, I believe, did you go back to the community and give feedback? What has been done ever since? How has the communities themselves benefited from the research itself?
So I think the good part in my case was that because my supervisor, Professor Michael Levine, was a clinician and he was an allergologist, which means his specialty was allergies. He had a wide network of people and a lot of other agencies that he was working with to try to map the allergy landscape of South Africa, right? And for him, I would say it started off as a research question that triggered his curiosity. The research question came from him as a scientist. I think which is a good thing from a perspective of he saw his. I'm saying this because as scientists, we are also good. We also need to be good citizens, right? So that's him showing that he wants to do something that is serving the community itself. But I think for me, it also highlights the distance between our communities and our research institutions, right? Because these are the things that I think communities should be able to talk to research institutions about. And there should be probably some frameworks that allow people to identify what is happening within local communities for each to warrant investigation, which isn't the case in most instances, because the biggest problem in Africa is that we do not fund our own research. So most of the research questions and the agenda for the research then becomes dependent on the donors, right? But in this case, at least we got to address the research questions that were affecting the population. And I think that was a win for us. And it's very rare that that happens itself. So yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No, it's fine.
I think it's just some of the things that I think future scientific research has to take into consideration. You have to be concerned about whether or not the research you are doing does reflect what is valued by the communities themselves. That's number one. Number two, I think it's also a question of whether or not you include the populations themselves. And of course, on the basis of mutual respect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yes, because they are co-producers of knowledge. They are not people that are waiting to be told what the problem is and to be told how the problem ought to be fixed. So just something to think about as we decolonize science, I think. But just to move forward with our very interesting discussion. Earlier in your work, you explored malaria prevention by integrating indigenous knowledge systems in the development of mosquito larvicides. How did that experience influence your understanding of the relationship between traditional knowledge and modern scientific methods? Over to you, Dr. Murangi.
Thank you. I think let me start by answering the last part of your previous question in that, yeah, it kind of skipped my mind, but like when it comes to what then happened after I finished my research, I think that's something that I'm constantly thinking about. Yes, it's a good thing that my professor and my supervisor was a clinician, so he did have other researchers that he was talking about the research, and he has presented a lot to the forums when it comes like to a lot of allergy forums about our work, right? Even at the World Allergy Organization, we have presented the work and it has been well received. But I often wonder if it actually got back to the community that we were serving. And I think it's a sad thing that even I, the researcher myself, cannot even answer that. And I think that shows what some of the institutions have become. What I mean by that is that in as much as we're doing amazing science and as much as we're doing the great thing, it has become more of a tick the box thing because, oh, now I have my PhD, now I can go. But I think if we have a framework where if you're doing a research, you also need to show relevance to society. But not only that, there needs to be a step further of, okay, you are Mr. We are not Dr. Chikwaza. You are working on climate change. Which community have you worked with and what have you done? I think that should be part of that should be part of the education process because that makes us really accountable to the communities that we're working with, which I think is very important. But then to move over to your other question now, to be honest, that was an eye opener because I've often been extremely interested in African medicine, right? I think I look at it kind of like in the same way as Chinese medicine and how Chinese medicine has like a whole field of its own where it is studied not from a perspective of it's being demonized, but is studied from a perspective of, oh, this is working. Why is it working? Right. But when growing up, you realize that you look at African medicine as, oh, this is demonic, right? And I think growing up in a Christian community, in a Christian country, that is often the thing with everything that is African. And but I've always wondered that you've had these communities living for so long, and you've had certain people that you grew up in the community seeing that they would tell you that they're eating this particular plant because their mother told them to, right? You've had kids being told that, oh, back in the day when we were eating porridge, we were putting this particular bark, we would shave it, we'll put it in the porridge, and it would make sure that the child grows well. And in my mind, I'm thinking, this has been done so many different times by so many different people. It seems to have yielded the same result. We have no idea why. To me, that is science. Because it is reproducible, it is measurable in a way, because you can talk to the people that have done it and seen that it is working. So when I was doing that particular project, it emanated from the fascination with this plant in Zimbabwe called uh, Zumbani, right? And another word for it would be Lipia javanica if you want to make it scientific. But also, I was thinking about other different plants, which is Mutsuvu, right? Or a Vitex pious, if I'm going to use the scientific term as well. So these are plants that are within the local community. And based on the fact that Zimbabwe is termed to have a high prevalence of mosquitoes, I was like, oh, okay, what were people doing in the past? And then when you go back to oral histories, when you go back, you realize that people would get Zumbani, right? And they would hang it, they would hang Zumbani on their windowsills. And what Zumbani would do, it would act as a mosquito repellent. And then I was asking myself, why not take this and also use it to create a larvicide, right? So the larvicide is not targeting the adult mosquito, it's targeting the mosquito as it is still growing. So you're going to take it, you're going to extract the oils from this plant, and then you're probably just going to fumigate it, use it for fumigation. So that was what my project was on. So it was pretty much coming from oral traditions and oral histories from the particular people that we're dealing with this. And I had to engage traditional healers to talk about to talk to them about it, because they have been doing it over and over again, and I wanted to see if it was working, and in my case it actually worked. So for me that was very humbling, because it made me realize that I'm not only the one that has knowledge, they have more knowledge than me, and I could benefit a lot from them. But it also highlights a very critical thing, in that as a scientist, if I want to do something with these communities, they need to be very involved and they need to feel involved. And for me, it was very interesting how interested in the research they were. And because we were speaking the same language, it became easier for them to articulate. It wasn't science anymore. It was a part of them. It wasn't science being done to them. It was being done for them. And they wanted to be a part of the conversation. They would check up on us. Oh, so what is happening? Oh, you're going to take it to the lab. Can we come and see like you do the thing? It made it worthwhile. And also I have to say, for me, the scientist, it made me see the reason why I was doing what I was doing. It stopped being about just getting a paper at the end of the day, and it started being about changing communities in real time, but also adding value to the knowledge that they already have.
To reflect on some of the things that you just mentioned right now, you were talking about how it got you thinking about uh, research being done for them, and I was hoping you would also add with them as well. I
Yeah.
think that, yeah,
Mm,
which is
yeah.
very important, because remember, the whole idea of decolonizing science at the end of the day is to make it democratic, is to democratize the research process. Look at how even the language that we use, referring to yourself as the scientist and referring to these people as just people or communities. But I think decoloniality, I don't know how you would think about this, but I think it also calls for us to rethink even how we define a scientist. Are we saying that they are not scientists? Are they scientists when we think about it from a different perspective? It's some of the things that, I mean, more the reason why we have to rethink thinking itself and
Mm.
unlearn, to relearn why we need a decolonial turn in the first place. But I was also thinking about the values of, as you were speaking, there's something that you mentioned that got me thinking about, it became an issue of not just producing a paper, and that gets me thinking and worried, because you remember, when you look at academia in general, not just science, we have this what we call the publish or perish syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like when it comes to academia, when it comes to scientists, it's more about you need to produce papers. It's not about the
Mm.
value that you are generating or the value that you are producing that will benefit real people, or these particular communities. So much to think about. What do we as societies lose when such indigenous and community-based knowledge systems are ignored or undervalued in global science? Maybe in 1 minute, what do we lose?
I think we'd lose the ability to make science impactful, right? And by science, I mean we tend to lose the knowledge that we currently have, because we are create like I think I love the way that you framed this from I was looking myself as a scientist and them as normal community members. I think that to start with has already made me other them, right? But but the thing is, I'm looking at this from this perspective. What I think the current educational system has done is create a situation where you go to school for the very purpose of being better than somebody else, right? You don't necessarily go to school for the purpose of being a responsible citizen or being a part of community to contribute effectively to the community, right? That is the reason why I felt like when I was going to them, I had more to give them than they had, right? Because I had been taught how to think, I had been taught how to do these things. But let's face it, they have been living in these environments for the longest time. these people were older than me. They were 40 years, 50 years older than me, right? And they had lived experiences of the knowledge that they had. I was, I knew knowledge from a theoretical perspective. They knew knowledge from an theoretical and experimental perspective, right? I might have known what molecules were, but they knew what was in it and what it was curing. They might not have known the base structure of the phytochemicals, but they knew what the science, but they knew that this thing was working. They knew how much of it to give. They knew when to give it, but they'd experienced that science. So I think by alienating these communities and allowing these hierarchies to perpetuate, we lose our ability to benefit a lot from the wealth of wisdom that these people have. I've often had conversations with my grandfather at some point, and I would always ask. And I remember that was during my undergraduate days when I was working on this particular project, and I was telling him what I was doing, and he was so fascinated about it on what that did to him, because I was talking about the plants that he knew. We started going walking within like in our front yard, and he was pointing at different flowers that we had, and he was talking about, oh, maybe you should try doing this with that particular plant because it cures this. Oh, do you have a stomachache? Take the roots of that and just grind it. And for me, I was like, I'm having a scientific conversation with a man that is 80 years plus. He has never been in any scientific institution to teach him medicine. And he's not even a traditional healer, he is just a member of community. But because when they were growing up, these things were passed down, was their fathers and mothers were doing this and they were seeing it, they were being trained in it. It wasn't something that you had to buy, right? It wasn't a philosophy for you to buy, but it was being taught so that the community could grow, so that everyone would be healthy, right? So I think by
Yes,
alienating by alienating those people, we tend to lose our access to new discoveries, right? And also we
absolutely.
tend to lose our ability to have effective policies because these people need to be involved for anything to work. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's a shame really because the reason why we have all those losses and we have that situation, it's all because of what Annibal Kiano refers to as coloniality of power, what Walter McNullo refers to as coloniality of knowledge, and what Nelson Maldonado Torres refers to as coloniality of being.
Mm.
Very, very important because it denies them epistemic virtue. And that is just a problem. And like you have already highlighted for us, it comes with a lot of loss on the part of societies and even on the part of you as the scientific
Yeah.
community and entirely the academic fraternity. So, just to take the conversation forward, because we are running out of time, I want us to talk about bridging science, policy, and storytelling because that's sort of where you left it off in your last statement. You have described your work as existing at the intersection of science, sustainability, and storytelling. How do you use storytelling to communicate complex scientific ideas in ways that connect with policymakers and communities? To tell you the truth, I got really excited when I saw the storytelling part because I consider that quite very important and I think that could really be a game changer as far as decoloniality is concerned. So yes, how do you use storytelling to communicate complex scientific ideas in ways that connect with policymakers and communities in 2 minutes? Thank you.
So I think storytelling, it has to be very contextual, right? And you need to talk about how people understand a particular thing and why they understand it in that particular way. So, like I'm saying, people don't need to know if I'm going to recite my thesis is going to be antigenic and immunological determinants of acute allergic susceptibility to meat. People don't need to know that, right? People want to understand, oh, I'm looking at how meat allergies to meat are being caused by exposure to ticks. That's people need to understand it from the perspective that they are living in. And I think that's where also humility comes into play and calls for scientists to be responsible citizens. We need to get out of the labs and we need to understand the language that the people are speaking and put ourselves in that particular situation and talk to them at the level that they're at. Yes, we need grants, we need all of those things, but we need to learn to put our stories in the context of our communities. And I think that is a skill that people need to know and understand. And the only way that you can know your communities is by engaging with them as well. So you cannot know how to structure your story if you're living outside of the community, right? Because the context is going to matter, right? If you're going to be talking to a person that is coming from Zimbabwe about food, talk to me about sadza, talk to me about like nyama, like a beef stew. Talk to me in that particular way. I'm going to understand it because that is something that I've grown up with, right? For example, if I'm talking about hemophilia, which is what I've been currently looking at, blood disorders, right? You can give an example that ties into the social context of things because the people within the particular the local people that you're trying to communicate to understand things differently, use the language that they understand, use traditional dances that they understand to try to talk about the thing that they are facing. For example, if we're going to look at a dance called Jerusalem in Zimbabwe, that can be used as a critical tool of making people understand sexual health, right? So storytelling, I think for me, for you to be effective, take what the people in that particular environment are currently doing and try to imagine what you are studying fitting into that particular space and into that particular context.
Absolutely. You serve as a Green Labs ambassador promoting sustainable laboratory practices and as an Immunopedia Ambassador contributing to global immunology education. How do these roles reflect your commitment to making science more ethical, inclusive, and environmentally conscious? In your view, what would a truly decolonial scientific ecosystem look like in practice? One that reflects African values, priorities, and worldviews?
I think first of all, Green Labs is more of an initiative to try and bring sustainability into how we do science. So it is looking at how we manage water, how we manage procurement, how we manage the chemistry aspect of everything that we're doing, right? With the essence of just trying to reduce wastes, trying to like to do everything in a cleaner, greener way, right? And then for me, when I was going through the whole training to become a Green Lamps ambassador, there's one thing that stuck with me is that sometimes the problem that people have when we bring up these terms is the fact that it is introduced as a new thing as compared as the right thing. If you talk to people about Green Labs, you are pretty much trying to make people do things in an ethical way, right? So good science is green science. And I think for me, it looks at what sustainability is or what science is supposed to be in the first place. This becomes a this becomes a very this becomes interesting from this perspective. I look at it from this perspective. If you're a scientist, the things that you're supposed to be doing are supposed to be for the betterment of humanity, right? So for starters, we're not supposed to be even talking about sustainability because the things we're supposed to be doing are supposed to be sustainable to start with, right? What I mean by that is that if science is supposed to be moving society forward, the guiding ethos of what we call a scientific achievement needs to be sustainable to start with. If it is a scientific leap but it is not sustainable, then that is for the bad of humanity and that should not be considered as good science, right? So I think that also ties into the ecosystem of what I feel like decoloniality should inform science. Because I think being African, we always talk about how you grow up realizing how your lived environment is a part of you in a sense, right? How you are a custodian or a guardian of everything that is around you. So whether you are thinking of um, building a house or whatever, you always think about your extended environment. How is my house going to, um, how is it going to influence my surrounding area? And I look at it from the perspective of decolonizing the scientific ecosystem from the perspective of if we're going to initiate any scientific project, how is it going, from what perspective is it going to be sustainable, right? How is it going to be beneficial to the people that are around it? Not only from, oh, this is how smart we are, but from a perspective of, oh, this is sustainable, this is bringing us together, and this is allowing us to be more human and bring us together. Right? Yeah.
We're just gonna go to another segment of our conversation, which is, of course, one of the concluding segments. We're going to talk about the barriers and opportunities. And we have to talk about these things in exactly 3 minutes, Dr. Murangi. Every transformative idea meets resistance. What forms of resistance have you encountered in trying to integrate decolonial and sustainable approaches within scientific spaces?
The biggest thing would be issues to do with sustainability. I think when you talk about sustainability and you bring it as a new thing, everyone is very resistant because you are adding something to the to-do list, right? But then when you, like what I was saying, like when you really break it down, sustainable science is good science, right? Instead of having to buy a lot of plastic molds when you're doing histology, buy the metal ones because you can reuse them. That is good science, right? I think the reframing and the use of language is very important, and it doesn't help that during, like, when you are in the education system, you are told that scientists are bad communicators. So that sticks with us, right? And because that sticks with us, now having to communicate to scientists becomes a very big thing because everyone becomes more worried about, it's all about the science. But at the end of the day, you want to create an ecosystem where we think really from a perspective of, you know what, we're not restricted because we are scientists. We're not restricted because we are in the field of science. I'm only supposed to be thinking about science, but we need to be multidisciplinary or undisciplinary because the things that we are proposing and the things that we want to do need to address the communities. So when we
Absolutely.
look at things not as new things, but as human things, and we look
Absolutely.
ourselves as guardians of society, I think that
Absolutely.
will move us forward.
Absolutely. And on the other hand, where do you see emerging opportunities for meaningful change, particularly in how the Global South leads in research, innovation, and knowledge production over the next decade? So, emerging opportunities there?
I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of opportunity in pharmaceuticals, right? But I think this is going to really depend on government's need and priorities because if our governments really fund these programs, I think they'll really take off and everything will be great. But what happens is that, like we're talking about issue, like the ones that funds the research is the one that gets to define the research questions at the end of the day. I think that's where Africa is lacking. So I think if we take the baby steps of making ourselves realize the true impact of science, then maybe we can have a situation where we start reframing research questions in a way that actually serves the people and gets people on board. Maybe, yeah.
Lovely. If you could share one piece of advice with young African scholars, whether scientists, writers, or activists, what would it be?
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. I think, like what I was saying, we need to get to a point where science is not done to us, but it is done by us, with us, and for us. If we get to that point, I think we'll build communities that are not only sustainable, but we bring humanity into science and we make this more of a global project. But yeah.
Lovely. That was really succinct. I loved it. Um, Now we are just moving on to the closing reflections segment, which is exactly 2 minutes. Dr. Murangi, this has been such a rich and insightful conversation. Before we close, I would like to ask if you could leave our audience, Global South Indian audience, with one key reflection on decoloniality to guide their everyday work and lives, what would it be?
We need to understand that what we know is enough. We don't need to change our ways of thinking to fit any particular sphere. We don't need to change ourselves for progress to happen. What we currently have is enough, and we need to invest in who we are for us to realize the great potential that we have. We already know the science, we already know everything that we'd ever need to develop our communities. What we need to do is to stop believing that we are less and be a part of the new inventions.
I'm just curious. What do you mean by that? What do you mean we already know all we need to know? What do you mean by that?
No, because I think it goes back to my whole thing of talking to indigenous communities, right? You realize they have a great wealth of knowledge that they have that is untapped. So we already know what we need for communities to advance. What is lacking at this point in time are the frameworks to make or to translate that knowledge into meaningful inventions and pharmaceuticals. And yeah.
Okay, so the knowledge is there.
The knowledge is there. We need to find ways of taking that knowledge and from making it alien and making it a part of our frameworks as we engage, when we create health policies, when we are creating badges. We need to take into account of that knowledge and make use of it.
Interesting. Dr. Murangi, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and for reminding us that decoloniality is not confined to theory. It lives in how we do science, how we teach, and how we engage with our communities. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to this episode of the Global South Indaba. To stay connected, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Global South Indaba and visit globalsouthopportunities.com for a wide range of opportunities, including jobs, internships, scholarships, fellowships, conferences, free online courses with certificates and grants. Until next time, let's continue to reflect, to question, and to build a world where knowledge is shared, inclusive, and transformative. Thank you and goodbye.